And that grandmother is actually in the short story, which is exciting. Yeah, so here we go. The title is Two Sisters. Before the day came to an end, before the heat from the engine cooled, before the smell of dinner reached the nose, Rachel sang. She sang the song of her life. Alone at the vast window she stood, overlooking yellowing plains of grass and brush. The orange fury of the setting sun contrasted with her turquoise blue eyes and caused her tan skin to glow. She absorbed the light. A remembering smile played on her features as the remains of the leisure day's sun strode further westward. But before the last rays of the reservation sun bathed her features, before she sang her song, Rachel ran. She ran with a full heart, a joyful spirit. Rejoicing at the strength of her lungs and the grace of her stride, she raced across the land. Years of training caused her to soar. Days of running competitively aided her flight. She gave a little skip and a hop as she maneuvered the terrain, just for the sake of feeling her calves leap with ease. Her mind, her wise, youthful mind was strong. It was because of her joyful heart and her strong mind that she ran swifter than any jog. As she moved, a kind of fullness seemed to come over her. Letting her breath, the rush of air, speak, she pulled breath in only to expel it. A silent, hallowed kind of speech saying, "I am alive." There, under the endless sky and red earth, like every run, every race that has taken place since the first evening and the first sunrise, this run came to an end. It came to an end with a surge of her stride, a throb of her heart, and a deep desire to finish strong. Rachel sprinted into her yard. With a final deep intake of life-giving air, Rachel allowed herself to feel the ache of her body, from the deep ache of her chest to the superficial chafe where her skin rubbed red. She welcomed the sting. She took pleasure in the hurt. She found satisfaction in the exertion. With trembling limbs, dust-clad legs, and a sweat-stained face, Rachel stood fully alive, and in that moment, she felt more beautiful than what the world told her she was. But that was before the song, the life-praising song of her life. That was before the sunset and the dinner-making. It was before the arrival of the truck that brought the news that caused that wonderful, life-fulfilling day to end. Sitting in the passenger seat, Rachel could feel the night sky looming and dancing outside the cab of the fast-moving pickup. For all her years of sky gazing, the expansion of open heaven and the piercing stars never ceased to awaken her emotions to something bigger than herself. Feeling a swelling sensation in her chest, Rachel said a silent prayer. Peace, wisdom, strength, guidance, please, she pleaded, wishing she was home and not on the road heading towards suffering. With a sigh, she forced herself to not behold the wonder of the night. Tonight, it didn't seem right to be in wonder of anything. She turned her wise turquoise eyes towards the driver of the pickup truck. She cared little about how pointed her gaze was. She knew full well that Najoni was aware of her stare. But the girl, the driver, with black hair and blue eyes, the same color as the turquoise jewelry she wore, kept her deep focus on the road before her. The road, cracked and dented with years of neglect, shook the truck and jostled its passengers. The rattling of the vehicle brought attention to the thick silence between the two. For most, the silence would be painful and overwhelming, but not for the two half-sisters. They didn't have the strength or the energy to feel uncomfortable around each other. Rachel took in Najoni's appearance, summing her up, and tried to calculate when she had seen her last. Not seeing one another was a point typically made. The two were not alike in appearance. Rachel, with her dark brown hair, tan skin, and slender form, stood 2 inches taller than Najoni. Najoni the sturdy, Najoni the beautiful, with her black hair, light brown skin, and solid fit form. The only true physical trait they shared was the blue eyes they inherited from their father. There were other things the two shared, like their deep maturity. Rachel was born an old soul, with a heart compelled to seek after understanding. Najoni was wise by experience. She had seen more life and all the trauma that came with it than most would see. But the two, they refused to be alike. They knew they were, but not a soul would ever catch them saying what they acknowledged in their hearts. After the long drive, back to the town where they were born, in the darkness, the two sisters, half-sisters, made it to the hospital. Rachel found herself in the same room with the father who had abandoned her. She was not alone. Najoni came after her. Amidst the jumble of hospital sheets and surrounded by a fortress of pillows lay a man she did not recognize. Rachel came to his side while Najoni stood on the other across the way. Rachel stared with eyes that wanted but could not feel past the numbness that kept her from having an ounce of compassion for the man before her. All she could see was him frequently leaving, him on the day that he left her family. Whether intentional or not, whether drunk or sober, he had begun a second family so near to her own that her half-sister's day of birth was the same year as hers. The girl's grandmother, Hope, eventually ushered them out, worried more for them, it seemed, than her son. Hope knew. What exactly it was she knew was hard to tell, but her confidence was strong and her composure came from a divine reassurance. Rest. We all need rest. We need to prepare for what is to come. He won't be alone. Come, let us go. After the hospital visit, Najoni went to her trailer and Rachel went to her grandmother Hope's hogan to spend a sleepless night. When the dark of night began to grow lighter, before the sun rose, she heard Hope preparing for the day. Don't let the sun catch you sleeping, she thought, and threw back the covers. Unsure what to do, she prepared for a run. Her grandmother praised her, saying, Go run and pray. As long as your heart is still beating, you have a purpose. Go bring the day. Stepping out into the dark, Rachel stood, shivering from the morning cold. Her only option was to run along the dirt road past a cluster of dilapidated trailers that belonged to Hope's extended family. Her family, too, a hesitant thought acknowledged. With a shaky breath, she started down the road, feeling numb of emotion. Not a minute in, she saw a figure stretching by the road near a turnoff. Seeing the solid fit form, Rachel's stride lost its confidence. Before she could avoid being seen, her sister Najoni looked up. Embarrassed by her hesitation, Rachel squared her shoulders and picked up her pace. Their father, never at the same time of course, taught them to breathe through their nose and out their mouth. He taught them how to pump their arms and how to not slouch their shoulders, how to push past the pain. It is all mental, he would say. They started their running careers not for fun, not for their culture, but for him. Running was the only thing they had in common with him. They did it all for him. But when both girls learned to run for themselves, they prospered and thrived. Running was a gift their father introduced to them. Though they learned to hate it before they loved it, it was the best thing he gave each. Rachel neared Najoni's turnoff. Her half-sister watched with a questioning, intense look, a look that was too much like an expression their father would wear. She seemed to hesitate, calculate, try to plan her next move. Just steps away, Najoni turned in the direction Rachel was going. Without a word, without a nod, Najoni fell into step beside her. Their pace was quicker than a normal run, but slower than their best. They followed a dirt, single-lane road. Before them was only earth and early morning sky. If you were a spectator observing the run, if there was a sports camera focused on their faces, you would see the moisture that would well up in one's eyes before being stifled. After a time, both were physically spent. It could be seen in the slack of their form, but they were not about to allow the other to know their weariness. Without a word being spoken, they ran side by side, neither one yielding, neither one slowing. Not caring or perhaps too tired to try, they didn't bother keeping even breath. They struggled together, yet very much apart, through sand, brush, and trash-littered land. Two halves of one's heart. So similar was their drive, how strong was their life fight, but they would never admit it. The hurt was too deep and too painful to show. On the two sisters ran. Rachel was physically and mentally spent. She knew not where they ran to or how far they still had to go. All she knew was the pace was getting faster and faster. Every bottled emotion she had restrained for years shook and threatened to come forth. At the end of the trail, Rachel didn't know where to go, but she was not going to stop. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Najoni point. In the direction of a worn goat trail, she had direction. The stitch in her side, the impaling feeling of a rod shooting through her that was being twisted relentlessly, caused her to hunch a little to the right. She stayed in stride with Najoni, followed her lead as they went straight to the mesa trail. At the foot of the mound of clay, sand, and rock, they began to climb. With chest throbbing, Rachel knew her heart would burst. She welcomed it. Burst, she urged, hoping the action would end all the suffering. Hand over hand, foot over foot, they climbed up the sloping peak, sand filling their shoes. Rachel gasped and choked for breath, the back of her throat raw and painful to the very touch of the air. Najoni reached the top before her and stooped, hands on knees, choking for air, wheezing in pain. Feeling as though all the internal pain had manifested itself into physical pain, Rachel knelt. With all her thoughts and worries, pain and emotion, victories and fault laid out before her, she felt the grip of her resolve slip, her determined composure wearing away, and she wept. She, so lost in herself, she forgot she was not alone. She collapsed on her back, feeling every prick of thorn and jagged rock, or perhaps broken glass, with every air pant from her hungry lungs. With eyes closed and the pulse of her heart's blood in her ears, she couldn't see or hear the girl sitting beside her. Worse than the throb of a muscle or the hammering of a heart was the lack of the compassion towards the man with the turquoise eyes. Rachel knew he was supposed to love and protect them. Then, the word quivered in her mind, not me or her, them two, the two sisters. A twist of the head and the open of the eyes beheld the other sister, still there, hurting alongside Rachel. As the heartbeat slowed and the quiet of the land settled around the two, they perched themselves where they had stopped. It was there that Najoni spoke, the first of the two that opened the doors to the stories that were hidden from the world, memories locked in the secret place of their heart. The stories of abuse and neglect slipped from both girls' mouths as they sat on the mesa top, the sun warming their exposed skin. Though the wounds that no one else could see, the ones that hurt too much to show, despite them, they displayed away. In the midst of the sting and hurt, there was comfort in knowing that someone else was walking the same suffering. There was no advice, no quick fix or solution, only burdens coming undone. The pain didn't recede, but came forth from a deeper somewhere. Thoughts that needed to be heard, heart-spoken feelings, and tales that demanded to be brought out of the dark into the light. They sat for a long while. Spoken aloud was the wonder of if he ever loved them for who they were. After they expressed the not-so-fluent sharing of heart distorted by a lifetime of brokenness, they knew they would not miss the relationship they had with the man who gave them their eyes, but they would mourn what could have been. After the bitter, weary silence, after the endless urging to move on day by day, after the wounds that no one else had seen were shown, after a life-fulfilling run, Rachel sang. Standing alone in the hospital room, she noticed the beeping of the life support machine, the whoosh of the oxygen, which gave melody to her song. She sang a sincere, sweet blessing, standing over the man who had taken a turn for the worse, the reckless father of two contrasting blue-eyed daughters. She didn't list every hurt and every way he had wronged her. Love does not keep a record of wrongs, whispered words that were etched in her heart. Rather, she sang of a seed having to die before it could grow, the way the sky was dark first before light came the first morning of the age. She placed her hand above his. The beep of the monitor showed no indication of his heart leaping at her touch. His eyebrows did not raise in a last effort to gaze upon his daughter with his striking blue eyes. Rachel waited. For years, she fantasized about such a moment, saw it in movies, silently wishing she could have an opportunity to sit on the deathbed and deliver a heartfelt goodbye. Now, in the moment, she was a witness to a man's last leg of his life race. Yellowing walls, which may or may not have once been white, drained the adventure away. The cold light ended any fantasy. She said her goodbye, heartfelt, leaned in slow, thanked him for trying his best, knowing full well it was because of his brokenness he could have never loved her the way she always wanted him to. For an instant it seemed all the years of hurt that had threatened to split her heart in two were present in the room. After everything, after the known and unknown, after the silence, there was the strain, emotion, raw, where the roots of bitterness were being pulled to one day be disposed of. Not a dying pain, but a healing pain. A shattered forgiveness and long to express love, to accept a peace that surpassed understanding, as it should. In that moment, the weight that was always above her, always before her, fell away. For the first time in a long while, her soul was silent. It was one of the most beautiful sounds. She felt an exhilarating relief, the kind of exhausting relief that comes when she has crossed the finish line. She crossed the finish line of that race, completely empty, yet more full than she had been in years. Then Najoni came into the room. Rachel, with tear-red, forgiving eyes, met the gaze of her sister. As one race was ending, another was beginning. It was time for the two halves of one soul, the two sisters, to begin a race together. A race run in celebration of life and for all things worth fighting for. Family, community, restoration, healing, love. On and on the list went, a never-ending list of sanctified blessings, gifts. As long as there's a heartbeat, there's a purpose. As long as there's a drum of life amidst silence, there's a race to be run and a dare to finish strong.
Thank you so much, Shania. I'm a very big Shania Smith fan. This is where I tell you all that she took her first ever fiction writing class with me. And I had the privilege of reading the first draft of that story, which I'm encouraging her to send to more than one literary magazine because it deserves to find a home. I'm so glad you'll be joining us next year. I have the privilege of introducing Leroux St. We met when we did a panel together at AWP about how to get your first story collection published. And the joke I made then, which I'll make again now, is that Lori's best case scenario and I'm worst case scenario. But it's sort of like, don't worry, you will get your story collection published someday, somehow. Leroux St, her story collection, The Bigness of the World, won the Flannery O'Connor Prize, so that's best case scenario. I'm on like a tiny little press, but you know, whatever. And also is the author of the novel After the Parade. I'm not sure which we'll be hearing from tonight, but I believe both are available for sale over at the book table. Yeah, awesome. So buy a book, meet this lovely human. If you've ever taken a class with me, you've heard me talk about Robin Black. She's basically my hero. So she's the friend in common that Lori and I have. And so I'm pleased to have met a friend through a friend. And I'm so excited to hear you read your work. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm happy to turn it up. I have a teacher's voice, but I also have a microphone. I thought that was going to carry me. How's that? Okay, because you know every mic is different. How's that?
Like an ice cream cone mic.
I don't eat ice cream.
Make love
But
to the mic.
make love to the mic. Woman back there that said no very loudly. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm most worried about you because you were the one who was very clear about it, which I appreciate. So I am going to read from my story collection. For so long I was reading from my novel because that came out most recently. And today we've just been driving this crazy, we drove from San Francisco to LA, and my wife and I, we did a reading there, and then we came here and did some things here, and then we went to Albuquerque. I had a broken car window throughout this also. All the wind and dust was coming in. Then in Albuquerque we fixed the car window. Came back here, we stopped in Holbrook overnight. And that was so interesting, and now we're here, and I'm delighted to be here, but tomorrow we're driving straight back to San Francisco. And so I thought, I'm going to read a piece from my novel that takes place in Needles, because it reminds me of, I used to do this trip so often, from Albuquerque to LA, or Albuquerque to San Francisco, and I thought, I'll read the part from Needles. And then I changed my mind, and I thought they would probably rather hear a story set in, Minnesota. So I'm going to read a story, part of a story. It's in 3 parts, and I'm going to read part of it. And it's a story that I was kind of writing when I was angry at my father. I always tell my students, never write a story for revenge. And so I started this story thinking this will show him. And not as if my father would ever read anything I wrote. But I started this story, and you always realize you learn something about people. So this story is fiction, but you will probably know way more about my family than you need to nonetheless. It's called Talking Foul with My Father. Talking foul with my father. 1. Turkey. A circular argument. My father wants to know what I had for lunch today. I haven't called in months, but this is what interests him. I had a turkey sandwich, I say. Turkey, he says with clear disgust. Last year, my father's doctor gave him a list of safe foods. Foods recommended for someone in my father's condition. Turkey was high on the list. My father has never liked turkey, except at Thanksgiving, and only then because it comes with all sorts of things that he does like. Fatty skins swaddled in strips of bacon, mashed potatoes, gravy, rolls and butter, ham, yes, ham. My father has always managed to treat turkey as the annoying but harmless relative who shows up once a year on the holiday. But now turkey has become my father's enemy. Of course, he has numerous reasons for not liking turkey, first among them being that he likes beef. And while this might not seem like a reason, it is what my father tells me whenever I ask him why he doesn't like turkey. Because I like beef, he says. It's not an either-or question, I say. It's like salt and pepper. You can like both of them. Now, if turkey and beef are sitting in a room alone and someone says that you can pick only one thing from the room, okay, then it's true. You can have turkey or you can have beef. But this isn't like that. Geraldine and I just spent our 10th anniversary in Greece. 2 blissful weeks walking where Plato and Socrates once walked, both of us nearly in tears at the thought of it. And here I am, 1 month later, having this conversation. Reason number 2, because it is on his list. Reason number 3, because my baby brother, whom he considers henpecked, eats turkey and some guise or other for dinner every night, or so my father claims. The one time that Geraldine and I visited my brother and his wife at their overly child-proofed house in a suburb of the Twin Cities, the 4 of us and their 5 children ate lunch together, turkey sloppy joes for the record, while discussing the pros and cons of my brother's retirement plan. As he spoke, he stared at Geraldine as though he couldn't quite figure out who she was or how she had come to be sitting at his wood veneer table. His wife, whom I was meeting for the first and what would turn out to be the only time, said very little during the meal. But when I reached for the water pitcher, she noticed my raggedy fingernails and broke her silence to announce bitterly that my brother chewed not just his fingernails, but his toenails as well. Addressing her complaints specifically to me, as though this were some sort of linguist family conspiracy for which I was equally answerable. Geraldine and I flew back to San Francisco that evening, and when I called my father several weeks later to tell him that we had made it home safely, the first thing he wanted to know was what my sister-in-law had served for lunch. Sloppy joes, I told him. And there was a short pause of disappointment before my father, who has never cooked anything in his life, replied triumphantly, "I'll bet they were turkey." You know, all she gives him is turkey. It is worth noting that the 2 parts of my father's argument regarding the state of my brother's diet and marriage are interchangeable, that both can and do function as conclusion or premise, depending on what we are arguing about. Whether my father is trying to convince me that my brother does eat turkey every day, or that he is indeed henpecked. Argument A. My brother is henpecked because he eats turkey every day. In this argument, my father is demonstrating that my brother is henpecked, and so the daily eating of turkey becomes his first and only premise, one that he nonetheless shores up amply: turkey breast burgers, chili lasagna, Everything's turkey with her. Argument B. Because my brother is henpecked, he eats turkey every day. Occasionally one of us, usually me, but sometimes my sister, will be foolish enough to suggest that our brother does not eat turkey every single day. My father, in this case, cites as proof the fact that my brother is henpecked. His argument succinct and unshakable. Of course he does. She doesn't even let him wipe his own ass. 2. Roasted chicken, a study in semantics. The cafe in Fentonville has 2 roasted chicken specials. My father begins the conversation, not bothering with more standard pleasantries. Mashed potatoes, a roll with butter, gravy, some kind of vegetable or other. It is as though he is reading love poetry over the phone, his voice greedy and helpless. I try to recall what roasted chicken is, how it differs from roasted chicken, what the addition of the B actually means. But the word has been dropped into the conversation with such ease that I know I cannot ask him to explain. Roasted chicken, he would reply automatically. The words so familiar to him that they are their own definition. Then, after the slightest pause, he would say it again. Roasted chicken. Asserting the words in a way that means both, you never visit, and what kind of world do you live in? It is true that I visit infrequently, once every 3 or 4 years, just as it is true that I live in a world devoid of roasted chicken. Which is not to say that there are no roasted chickens in San Francisco. Of course there are. There would have to be. Sometimes when I have not called my father in a particularly long time, he will begin the conversation by announcing, a lot has changed. Then he will proceed to fill me in on events that happened years ago as a way of making clear my neglectfulness. Your sister got married, he will say, though my sister has been married for 7 years and has 2 boys. Odd little fellows who refuse to speak to me on the telephone because they are busy cutting. Each boy has his own cutting box, a cigar box in which he keeps a pair of blunt-ended scissors and his most recent clippings, advertisements for cereal and batteries, as well as carefully snipped photos of dead ducks and elk from his father's hunting magazines. When I ask to speak to them, my sister holds out the receiver and I hear Trevor, who just turned 6, saying, tell her to call when we're not cutting. All they do is cut, my father complains. My sister has told me that they are afraid of my father, afraid of his largeness, of the way that his feet seem poured into his shoes, the flesh straining against the laces so that they can no longer be tied. They're afraid of the way that he falls asleep talking and then awakens with a start a moment later, screaming, what? When they have said nothing, because anger has become his most immediate response. I doubt you'd even recognize this place, my father says at other times, referring to Morton, the town where I grew up, the town where he has always lived, except for a brief period just after high school when the Army borrowed him. This was in 1945 at the very end of the war, which was over before he got any farther away than Florida. But something about the experience put him off of the world, unnerved him so much that he forgot about college and went immediately back to Morton, picking up where he had left off, helping my grandfather run his hardware store, and eventually taking it over himself. He continued to read, preferring characters to actual people, and maintained an extensive library, which he housed in our basement, choosing the only room that was windowless, as though having so many books were something best kept secret. Still, the world outside worked its way in, entering through small fissures in the house's foundation that grew larger over time, filling our basement with water. Spring was particularly insidious, for as the snow outside slowly melted, the water level rose within, gradually, as though a tap had been turned on somewhere within the bowels of the house, a tap that none of us could locate, left open to a small but unstoppable trickle. For many years, it was our job, my siblings and mine, to mop up the standing water, but as we got older, we procrastinated just a bit more each time until finally our parents grew tired of our laziness, tired of their own nagging, and laid down thick carpeting throughout the entire basement, a cheap urine-colored shag that they said would act as a giant sponge. And in this way, our basement was turned over to the mold. Throughout my childhood, I liked my father's library better than any other room in the house, liked the moldy smell of books that hung in the air and clung to my clothing. In fact, I considered this the natural odor of books and wondered each time I checked out a book from the school library what they had done wrong that caused their books to smell as they did, of paper and ink and the sweatiness of children's hands. My father proceeds to give me an oral tour of Morton over the phone, block by block, resident by resident, as though proving my absence to me. We've got Amish now, he tells me. Dan Klimak's got them working out at the cardboard plant he put in just east of town. But when I ask who Dan Klimak is, my father uses the voice that he would use to explain roasted chicken to me if I were foolish enough to ask. Dan Klimak, Danny Klimak, of course you know Danny Klimak, he says, his voice startled and angry, the syllables like waves beating frantically against the shore. This is a metaphor that would make no sense to my father, for he has lived his entire life surrounded by lakes and ponds, placid bodies of water whose waves do not beat or pound or crash, but rather lap gently at the shore, a steady, soothing sound, like that of a cat drinking milk. Somehow, almost unintentionally, I became a teacher, a profession of which my father greatly disapproves, considering it a waste of my talent and on some level suspect. Teachers and preachers, he is fond of saying, never pay their bills. For several years, I taught high school English, which is how I met Geraldine. But eventually, I grew tired of counting my successes in such meager ways. And so I quit and began instead to teach English to adults, to foreigners who need me and thus nod patiently when I require that they answer, "How are you?" with, "Well," even though out in the real world, people are quick to correct them, explaining you need to say good. Well just sounds like you're kind of depressed. I begin class each Monday morning with a vocabulary quiz, testing them on words that we have encountered over the semester and compiled into a list, adding to it daily and occasionally winnowing it down, letting it drop those words and expressions that might have meant something to them back home, where they were pilots and geneticists and science teachers, but contribute nothing to their lives here. They're not lazy people, my students, but on Monday mornings, overwhelmed by the week ahead, they become late. Overwhelmed by the week ahead, after a weekend spent delivering pizzas and cleaning houses, they become lazy. They become lazy, and in their laziness, they write things like, "Threaten is to make a threat," and "shoplifter is someone who shoplifts." Knowing, of course, that I will mark their answers wrong, that I will write in the margins next to them, "A word cannot be used to define itself." 3. The pheasant as overt symbol. My father wants to FedEx me a pheasant. A pheasant, I say. I doubt that FedEx delivers poultry. Pheasants aren't poultry, he corrects me. English teachers should know such things. They're fowl, but they're not poultry. Poultry is domestic. I shot this bird myself out near the pond on Lacander's farm. For the last year, according to my sister, my father's been using a broom as a cane, bristles up, leaning heavily as he goes from bedroom to kitchen, from kitchen to bathroom. I'm fairly sure that this is the first broom he has ever held in his life. This is the same man, after all, whose mother washed his hair for him until he was 40, which is when he married my mother, and she took over the task. "When?" I ask, keeping my voice casual. "When did you shoot it?" "How would I know when I shot it?" he replies impatiently. "Well, when was the last time that you hunted?" I ask, feigning ignorance. I know the answer to this. know that he has not hunted in 5 years because my brother-in-law Mike, who used to take my father hunting, stopped hunting 5 years ago after his brother, while looking up and tracking a flock of mallards with his eyes, tripped over a rock and discharged his gun into Mike's buttocks. The doctors were able to extricate all of the shot, but for weeks, sitting had been uncomfortable, if not downright painful, which meant that Mike had also had to endure the embarrassment of explaining to his clients why he suddenly preferred to stand during sales calls. Mike is a fertilizer salesman in Fargo, North Dakota. A description that here in San Francisco sounds like the setup for a joke. But to Fargo, where he and my sister really do live, and where he really does sell fertilizer, having a sister-in-law who lives in San Francisco with her girlfriend is considered just as funny. I like my brother-in-law, whom I've met only twice, both times during visits that Geraldine and I made to Fargo. The first time we shook hands and he said that I was like a plague of locusts, visiting once every 7 years. I laughed because it was funny and sort of true, wondering whether the illusion was inspired by religion or profession. I suspected the latter. Locust plague struck me as the sort of thing that a fertilizer salesman from North Dakota would know about. Locusts are actually the only invertebrates considered kosher, said Geraldine, addressing both of us, though she and Mike had not yet been introduced. Really, I said, and then, Mike, this is Geraldine. They nodded at each other in a decidedly Midwestern way, though Geraldine is anything but Midwestern. Yes, not all species, of course, she continued, her tone turning cautionary. Actually, I believe that only the Yemeni Jews still know how to determine which species are kosher. Are you Jewish, Mike asked Geraldine, who, despite the deceptive first name, is Jewish, though Jewish strictly in the "isn't it interesting that locusts are kosher" sense. Yes, she replied, culturally speaking. Mike nodded deeply, as though this were a distinction of relevance in Fargo, North Dakota. Later that afternoon, as we sat playing with the boys, my sister turned to Geraldine and said, "I hear you're Jewish." "News travels fast," I said. "Jewish," said Mike's mother, who was also visiting for the day, though in her case from just 60 miles away, a town called Florence, which is where Mike grew up. Florence, North Dakota, my sister had informed me, was even smaller than Morton, about a third the size, which put the population at around 70 people, 2 of whom were sitting here in front of me. There was something vaguely impressive about this. "You know about the Holocaust," Mike's mother said. I could see that Geraldine was bewildered by this question, and she remained so even later when I explained to her what I knew to be the truth. It wasn't that Mike's mother believed Geraldine might actually be unaware of the Holocaust, but rather that she was establishing her own awareness, broaching the subject the way we are taught to where I come from, by turning knowledge into a question. Of course, only I could tell that Geraldine was annoyed, and when she answered, her voice was gentle, reassuring. Yes, she told Mike's mother, she did know about the Holocaust. And Mike's mother nodded, pressing the back of her fork tines against the crumbs of her rhubarb cake. It was a terrible thing, she said. I will stop there.
All the books are on sale this evening. Thanks to our friends at Brightside. Thanks for coming out and spending like a late night with us. Her short story collection, The Jungle Around Us, won the 2015 Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction. The collection was also a finalist for the California Book Award and was on the San Francisco Chronicle's 100 Best Books of 2017 list. Clara Monchine's Melancholia, also a novel, was published in 2002. Raef's stories and essays have appeared in the New England Review, Ziziva, and Guernica, among other places. She's proud to be a high school teacher and works primarily with recent immigrants. She lives in San Francisco with her wife and 2 cats. I want to mention briefly, too, that Ann Cummins introduced us to Winter Kept Us Warm this semester in our graduate fiction workshop, and that we fell in love with the rich historical details and interwoven lives of 3 individuals and their relationships to one another. And when we got to talk to Anne last week, she told us that one thing she does as a writer is she keeps history and story together. There's no separation between the two. And because so many of us here are writers who love to read and who love history and rich details and characters, I know that you will love this book as much as we have. So without further ado, Anne, welcome to Flagstaff.
Everybody, thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Anne. Thank you to this great bar, which we're not getting to appreciate fully, but thank you. But thank you. I like the idea of having a reading in a bar. And because of that, I'm going to read a part from my book that takes place in a bar. So I thought that would be. It's not going to be funny though. I can warn you that. I'm going to give you a warning about that. I don't know if I can follow Lori's reading, but we'll have to put on our serious hats a little bit. Well, it's not so serious. You can laugh if you want. Anyway, so normally when I read, I read right from the beginning of the book. But tonight, because we're in a bar and I have a little bit longer to read, I thought I would read another chapter. So there's not much setup that's needed, but this book, the book actually opens in Morocco in the present, and it's a book about a kind of unusual love triangle, two men and a woman, and it opens with one of the men coming to Morocco unannounced to see the woman that he's always been in love with, but never was able to be with after not seeing her for 40 years. So the present story is about that. I'm going to read the part where the 3 meet, and they meet in a bar. And so the book, the past story of the book begins in 1945 in Berlin, right at the end, right after the war is over. And the woman is Uli, who's a German woman, and the 2 men are 2 American soldiers. One of them, who's a recent refugee from Europe, who was then immediately drafted into the army when he arrived in the United States, and the other is a young man from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Both of these young men were not in combat because they both have physical disabilities. One of them has asthma, the other one has a rheumatic heart, and so they met at a POW camp in Prescott, Arizona. There was, I don't know if you know this, but there was a big POW camp here in Prescott, Arizona during the war. So I'm going to begin first with just a brief description. The woman Uli, kind of after the war is over and Berlin is devastated, she kind of leaves her family home and she's wandering, and she ends up kind of occupying an abandoned apartment building in New York, in Berlin. I'm just going to read you just a very short section of that, and then I'll read you the scene in the bar. And I'll have to take my glasses off because I can't see you and my well, maybe I can. This is kind of, I'll try. I have these new glasses, maybe they'll help. Okay, I'll try. So this is the opening of the apartment. It was terrible, the winter of 1945. If she believed in God, Uli would have had to believe that God felt they had not been punished enough, that Europe needed more battering, more misery for their... I can't read it.
Start over again.
Okay. It was terrible, the winter of 1945. If she believed in God, Uli would have had to believe that God felt they had not been punished enough, that Europe needed more battering, more misery for its unaccountable sins. By the end of the war, after hundreds of air raids, almost half the residents of Berlin had abandoned the city, escaped to the countryside, but Uli and her parents had stayed behind, partly because they had no relatives in the country, and partly because the buildings on their block stayed standing to the end, though all around them was shattered glass and rubble heavy with snow. At night, the bombed-out structures groaned like dying soldiers, and Uli lay awake listening to beams and bricks breaking loose and falling. Otherwise, the nights were quiet. Some would have said it was a deathly quiet. The bombed-out blocks, the snow, the hunched citizens in frayed coats clutching bags of potatoes and carrots, more snow. But it was this quiet, this absence of sirens and airplanes overhead, the absence of bombs falling, that saved Uli from despair. During the day, she walked for hours from one end of the American zone to another, avoiding human contact. On one of these walks, Uli found the apartment of a family who had disappeared. It was on a day when she felt that she could not spend another moment with her parents, sitting in their unbombed home, talking about the future of their typewriter business, which to her seemed not like a future at all, but a return to the terror and drudgery of the past. On her previous walks around the city, she had not been moved to wander into any buildings. Her whole purpose was to stay outside in the open, to breathe in the air. Interiors suffocated her, but she found herself climbing the worn wooden stairs, holding onto the banister, listening to her footsteps echoing in the stairway, pushing the door ajar, sitting down on the sofa, just sitting, waiting perhaps for someone to find her, to order her to leave. Outside, the day turned to dusk, the furniture to shadows. She grew hungry, but she could not bring herself to get up. So that's just the introductory section to give you a feel of Berlin. I think you can hear if I'm like this, right? Because otherwise it's pumping.
It's actually, I think you do need it up a little bit.
A little bit,
higher.
okay.
Can you see? Because I know it's dark.
Yeah, okay, it's a little dark. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is the chapter called The Meeting, which follows this other chapter that I just read you the beginning of. It's really dark. I'm sorry, my eyes are just not good. Okay.
You can probably
It's
turn
dark.
the
I
lights
knew
up.
you were going to have trouble because it's a little dark.
It's hard for you to, yeah. Okay. Post-war Germany was rife with opportunities, and Uli soon found her place in the post-war economy. She stumbled upon her new livelihood in a bar frequented by American soldiers and young German women who were looking for salvation in the arms of a homesick boy from Iowa or Alabama. When she first started going to these bars, she too believed in this possibility, and she often found herself waking up in an overly soft bed in a dingy hotel room next to a pimply boy with sour breath and a hangover who talked about his mother's cooking and cars. It took quite a few such encounters before she realized that it was safer and more lucrative to play Cyrano for the lonely soldiers and their hopeful German girlfriends than to play at love herself. The business started out quite innocently. Because of Uli's skill with English, soldiers solicited her help with the women they were interested in wooing. A soldier would ask her, for example, to tell a prospective candidate that she had a beautiful smile. The woman would laugh, he would buy her a drink, and she would ask him where he was from. At this point, Uli would ask him to tell her about his hometown, and she would tell the woman about the soldier's sisters and about what sports he had played in high school, and the woman would invariably want to know whether he had been to New York and whether he had seen the Empire State Building. In turn, the woman would tell him about the fresh cheese on her grandparents' farm, for so many of them had come from the countryside to seek their fortunes in the city. And before long, they would be thanking her, the soldier pressing a few bills into Uli's hands before stumbling out of the bar, arm in arm with his date. Thus, Uli became well known for her services in a number of the bars the soldiers frequented. With the money she earned, she could buy everything she needed on the black market: real coffee, vodka, stockings. She slept until 11 or 12 and spent the afternoons wandering the city or reading. It was in one of those bars that Uli met Leo and Isaac. They were sitting at a table in a back corner as far from the dancing as one could get. She noticed them immediately because they paid no attention to the girls. They seemed to be talking about something important, leaning in towards each other, gesticulating. It was a slow night for Uli, so she sat at her usual table watching them. They were drinking quite heavily. Every so often, Leo called the waitress over and ordered more drinks. Isaac was tall and thin, yet he did not have the usual slouch that tall, thin people have. He sat straight, and Uli could see that his fingers were long and thin too, like a pianist's. And when he leaned back in his chair, letting his arms fall to the side, his hands touched the floor. Leo was neither tall nor short, stocky but not fat. She noted his handsome square face. His lips were thick, almost like a woman's, yet not feminine at all. They seemed so engaged in their conversation that she was taken off guard when the waitress brought her a drink and pointed to their table and said, "Compliments of the soldiers." She tried to refuse it. "Thank you," she said, "but I was just leaving." "It's already paid for," the waitress told her, "so you might as well drink it." "Thank you, but perhaps you would like it," Uli suggested. "I'm not allowed to accept drinks from the customers," she said, leaving Uli with a drink. Instead of taking a sip, Uli lit a cigarette and looked away from Leo and Isaac. Of course, she could have put on her coat and gloves and hat and walked out the door. She was quite sure that neither of them would follow her. She felt, however, that this was a test, that she had no idea about what, so she did not leave, but she did not take a sip of the drink either. She tried to concentrate on the music and the dancers, who were by this time stumbling drunkenly around the dance floor. Finally, the stocky soldier stood up and approached her. He picked up the untouched drink and downed it in one gulp. "Thank you," he said, and returned to his seat. She left soon afterward, giving herself just a few more minutes so it would not seem that she was running away from them. "Good night, madam," the soldiers called out as she made her way to the door, but she did not respond. Usually there were other people out when she went home, but it was a particularly cold night, so the streets were completely deserted. The trees were covered with ice, and the cold seemed to amplify the sound of her steps on the deserted street. She thought for a moment that she should be afraid of walking alone, but she did not feel any fear and was proud of herself for her adventurousness. If she had been the kind of person who whistled, she would have whistled, but instead she unbuttoned the top of her coat. She did not want to feel constricted. The next night, Uli returned to the bar, but the two soldiers were not there. She spent the evening translating for a young man from New Jersey, whose father owned a butcher shop where he was planning to work when he got out of the army. "We've got a classy clientele," he kept assuring his plump young girl. Uli had read somewhere that Frank Sinatra was from New Jersey, so she told the girl that Frank Sinatra used to be their customer, and the girl smiled, saying she adored Frank Sinatra. The soldier was not at all puzzled by the fact that the conversation had suddenly turned from meat to Frank Sinatra, for he too was a great admirer. Uli never thought of her inaccuracies as lying, but rather as embellishments, little flourishes she added, like the illuminated first letter in medieval manuscripts. She did it not because she wanted to trick the girls, but because she wanted them to find what they were looking for, a way out. Yet sometimes, if she sensed something particularly mean or annoying about one of the soldiers, Uli would put words in his mouth that any woman, even the most naive, would not be able to ignore. She told a very pretty and very young girl, whose father and brothers had been killed on the Russian front, that the young man from Indiana she admired so had robbed a liquor store at gunpoint. He had been telling Uli that he preferred a wife who did not understand what he was saying. He worried that she would learn English once they were in the United States, and then he would be at a disadvantage. Uli asked him why, then, he had enlisted her services, and he said he wanted the girl to feel comfortable. "Women like to talk," he said. "But if I had my way, we wouldn't say a thing. Then there would never be any disagreements." When the girl left him for another soldier, a fat redhead from Maine, he blamed Uli. The man was brutish, but not entirely stupid. Interestingly enough, most of the soldiers did not engage Uli's services. Perhaps, even though they did not put it into words, they too liked not having to talk. It made things simpler, more straightforward. Uli's clients were the romantic ones, she supposed, and she liked to think that the brides they took back with them to small towns across the United States were not disappointed when they were finally able to understand their husband's words. She wondered whether the woman with the boy whose family owned the butcher shop had ever figured out that Frank Sinatra had not been their customer. And if she had, whether it mattered. Perhaps they shared a laugh about it. Or perhaps there had been so many other letdowns by then that even Frank Sinatra seemed insignificant. The next time Uli saw Leo and Isaac, a few nights after their first encounter, they were sitting at the same table. Uli mingled with the other customers looking for someone in need of her skills. She never pushed herself on anyone, but if she noticed a couple trying to communicate, she would approach politely and explain what she could do to help. Uli was standing at the bar when the tall soldier got up and made his way to her. "My friend and I would like to invite you to our table for a drink," he said, like a butler announcing the arrival of an important guest. He spoke perfect German. "I'm sorry, but I'm waiting for someone," she replied. He bowed, almost imperceptibly, and retreated. Uli grew tired of standing at the bar, so she found a table. After about an hour, the stocky soldier came to her table. "Are you still waiting?" he asked in English. "Yes," she replied. "For a client or for personal reasons?" "It is none of your business," she said. "True," he said, and sat down without asking for permission. "Cigar?" He took out two cigars from his breast pocket. "My friend can't stand the smell. He used to have asthma." Uli took the cigar and watched as he flicked open his lighter in that way men think is so gallant. She leaned toward the flame and breathed in. "Cigarette smoke doesn't bother him?" she asked. "It bothers him, but cigars he can't tolerate at all." During this exchange, Uli was waiting for Isaac to turn around to see what kind of progress Leo was making, but he had taken out a book and was reading. She wondered how he could read a book in a noisy bar. Perhaps he was only pretending. "You're a natural," Leo said. "A natural what?" Uli asked. "A natural cigar smoker. Never trust a cigar smoker, you know." "Why not?" she asked. "Because they're not trustworthy. It's a known fact." "Thank you for the advice," she said, which made him laugh. Every time he tried to speak, he would break out into laughter. Finally, he said, "My name is Leo." "Uli," she said, extending her hand across the table. "Isaac," he called to his friend. "Isaac, come over here and meet my friend Uli." Isaac waved and went back to his book. "He's always got his nose in a book," Leo explained. "There's nothing wrong with reading," Uli said. "I didn't say there was anything wrong with reading. I was just trying to explain his rudeness." "Rudeness? You don't think it's rude to sit there reading a book when I very nicely asked him to make your acquaintance?" "No." That made him laugh again. "Would you like to take a walk?" he suggested. "No, thank you," Uli replied. "Well, then we'll just have to have another drink." He called the waitress over and ordered a round of drinks for them and for Isaac at the other table. "So," he continued, "tell me the truth. Who is this person you're waiting for?" "I'm not waiting for anyone," Uli answered. "But you told Isaac you were waiting for someone." "Yes, but I'm not. I just said I was in order to be rid of you." "Well, I'm glad you told me." "Why?" "Because I like to know where I stand in situations like this." "Situations like what?" Uli asked. "Complicated ones." "I don't think the situation is at all complicated," Uli answered. Now it was her turn to laugh. "What's so funny?" he asked. "The situation," she said, and they both laughed, but she didn't really know why she was laughing, only that she wanted to, that it had been a long time since she had done so. "Excuse me a moment," he said, getting up and returning to the table where Isaac sat. They talked for a while, but Leo kept watching her out of the corner of his eye, as if doing so would keep her from leaving. Uli had time to smoke a cigarette before he returned to her table with Isaac in tow. He formally introduced them to each other, and Isaac and Uli shook hands. Leo pulled his chair up next to Uli's, and Isaac sat across from them. "What were you reading?" Uli asked Isaac. Oh, some kind of French poetry, Leo answered for him. He takes that book everywhere he goes. You speak French too, she asked. Yes, Isaac answered. I don't know why he needs the book, Leo said. He knows all the poems by heart. Not all of them, Isaac said. I don't have a photographic memory like you do. All he has to do is look at a page once, and it's in his head. I always thought there wasn't really such a thing as a photographic memory, Uli said. Well, there is, Isaac said. Show her. Now come on, it's not really so interesting. Why don't we all go for a walk? I'm getting tired of this place. But it is interesting. I'm sure she would be interested, wouldn't you? Her name is Uli, Isaac. I'm sorry, of course, Uli. You would be interested, wouldn't you, Uli? It's not necessary, she said, realizing only then that Isaac was drunk. He had seemed so quiet, so steady, sitting there reading his book, so she had attributed his awkwardness to his height, not to alcohol. Nothing is necessary except for food and shelter, Isaac said. And love, Leo said, turning to Uli. Don't you think love is necessary? Not in the same way as food and shelter, she replied. Isaac was looking away, watching the dancers. But necessary in some way, right? Leo continued. Well, Isaac interrupted, I thought we were going for a walk. Then let's go, Leo said, jumping up and grabbing Uli's hand, whisking her towards the door. Isaac grabbed their coats and followed. And I'll stop there.